I enjoy it. I thought it was a good show on Monday night, and congrats to Vladito, who won the Derby, and also I think nailed a kid in left field. I don't know if anybody caught that, but one of the kids out there shagging fly balls caught more of a line drive off the dome. I think it might have got a kid in the face, but hopefully everybody was okay after that. Moral of the story, Vladimir Guerrero Jr. wins a Derby. I believe his father won a Derby once upon a time, so it was inevitable that the younger Vlad was going to get one eventually, and he did so on Monday night. But tonight we're not going to spend the bulk of the time talking about that. We're going to talk, as we alluded to yesterday, about the idea of which Cardinals position players might be up on the trade block, which might make sense to trade, and honing in specifically on Nolan Gorman, sort of discussing the merits of keeping him versus maybe John Mozeliak and company floating him at this trade deadline, as the Cardinals clearly are seeking starting pitching. An upgrade to that rotation, it's going to be necessary for 2024. Could Nolan Gorman potentially be part of that? We'll kind of dive into the pros and cons and how his recent performance could potentially impact what we think of him as a player and what we think of him as potential trade bait for the Cardinals. Because, again, we've talked about a lot how they've got a handful of young, controllable position players that some are maybe boxing out the others in terms of playing time and a little bit of a redundancy in terms of their defensive positioning. And maybe one of those guys could serve to help the Cardinals find that answer in the starting rotation that they are not only searching for in 2023, but that they'll certainly be searching for next season, provided Wainwright retires, Montgomery and Flaherty are gone in free agency. So a lot of moving parts there, which leads us into the conversation tonight. But before we get into it, want to remind you guys to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Brenden Schaeffer, St. Louis Cardinals writer, been on the grind over the past week. Daily Cardinals content here on the channel. If you guys appreciate hearing daily Cardinals content, it would mean a lot to me if you would hit that subscribe button as we continue to build this channel up. Look at where we've gotten all the way from basically no subscribers at the beginning of April to over 1,200 now. So appreciate all of you who have been watching, who have been liking the videos, and commenting with your thoughts on the latest with the St. Louis Cardinals in a season that has otherwise been pretty forgettable. You guys helping to make it worthwhile here on the YouTube channel, which you can find, by the way, at youtube.com/@bschaeffer12 if you've never found it. If you're listening perhaps on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or maybe another podcasting app, would love to get you on board with YouTube as well, as I feel like some trade deadline live streams are in the offing, given the amount of movement we expect for the Cardinals over the next 3 weeks. Could end up happening down the road. But you can also follow B. Schaef Daily, the podcast, on Spotify, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts as well for audio-only versions of this daily Cardinals podcast that you're listening to right now. And to take your support of the channel to the next level, we'd love to have you check out patreon.com/bschaeffer12. Tonight as well on the podcast, I want to get into one specific Day 2 draftee of the St. Louis Cardinals, a kid they took in the 4th round, Quinn Mathews, out of Stanford. And it's possible that about a month ago, you heard his name after the senior at Stanford, 6'5" left-hander, threw 156 pitches in a complete game win over the Texas Longhorns in a super regional game for the Stanford Cardinal. 156 pitches in a complete game. We'll tell you what Randy Flores, the Cardinals director of scouting, had to say as they evaluated Quinn Mathews. What did they think throughout that process about the fact that not about a month ago, this kid threw over 150 pitches in a single game? Randy Flores and the Cardinals had a Zoom with the local media earlier on Monday, and that question did come up. So we'll tell you a little bit about what took place there as we go along tonight on B. Schaef Daily. But let's get started with the conversation that we teased on yesterday's show, which if you missed it, you can go back and listen to our discussion of Chase Davis, the Cardinals' first-round pick. We spent about 20 minutes on him on Sunday night, as well as talking about the weekend that was for the Cardinals out there in Chicago on the south side. So make sure to scroll back on your podcast feed to check that out if you missed it. But let's go ahead and get into the conversation on Nolan Gorman, because as we look, and this is going to be a little bit more freewheeling than the previous episodes because we don't have like a blow-by-blow of a Cardinal game to break down. It's going to be the nature of the beast this week, but make sure you let me know what kind of Cardinals topics would you like to hear about over the next couple of days. We'll talk All-Star Game tomorrow, I'm sure, but then there will be a couple of days where it'll be dealer's choice. So at bschaeffer12 on Twitter, let me know, what do you want me to talk about as we continue to do podcasts all week? I'm hoping to do one every day without an off day. We'll see if we can accomplish that, but topics are definitely welcome over the next couple of days at bschaefer12 on Twitter, or hop into the YouTube comment section and say, hey, talk about this on Wednesday. What do you think? And I very well just might. But we talked about it a little bit. The Cardinals need pitching. We know they need starting pitching. They came into this season thinking, hoping, praying, squinting, and closing one eye and maybe covering the other with their hand, that potentially they'd have enough starting pitching this year, and it simply has not happened. Now, we did talk about a little bit how this weekend things started to come around, especially if Jordan Montgomery remains healthy. You like what you got from Michaelis. Steven Matz, resurgent, basically from beyond the grave of consideration in the rotation, coming out with a really nice performance on Sunday. How much can we expect that to be the case moving forward? I don't think we really know based on one outing alone, but it was nice to see. But by and large for this season, the Cardinals have simply not gotten the job done in the rotation, and it's something that we really do believe John Mozeliak and company could have anticipated in the offseason when there was still time to sign free agents, to maybe make waves in the trade market, to do something to get this starting rotation on par for what it needed to be in order to make a run at the NL Central. And remember, we talk a lot about, hey, what do the Cardinals have to do now to get back into the mix in the NL Central? And the reason for that is because they are so far out of the mix that it's really the only thing that we could cling to and hope for in sight to say, well, you're 11 and a half games back. But remember, coming into the season, the thought process wasn't really focused on winning the division, which the Cardinals were able to capture last season. But no, it was more about, hey, once you get to the playoffs, once you get back to October, what are you going to do about it when you get there? And it was sort of in the minds of a lot of people, I think, a foregone conclusion that the Cardinals, with arguably an improved lineup 1 through 9 compared to what they had last year. I know Albert Pujols was departed, but you did bring in Wilson Contreras. You were expecting steps forward from guys like Nolan Gorman, who obviously we're going to spend some time talking about tonight. But then there's Jordan Walker, wasn't a part of last year's team and conceivably would have filled a role this year, which he has certainly done to this point. Thought the offense would be pretty good. The rotation, it was a lot of question marks. I think you could have made the case that 1 through 5, basically everybody had some level of question mark. And honestly, when John Mozeliak made the commentary about having 6 starters and all these things, you could say 1 through 6, 1 through 7, 1 through 8. There weren't a lot of certainties, I don't think, with this Cardinals rotation. Some people might have said at the time, well, you're just looking for the negatives. They've got a lot of decent pitchers, a lot of solid guys, and to say there are question marks about every single player is maybe not fair to these players and the work that they've put in and the talents that they have. And that's fine, but you would think at least a median outcome would be realistic. And I would say at this point, the Cardinals have had maybe close to a median outcome for Jack Flaherty, has had some rocky moments, some disappointments, but has also shined in ways that you've come to expect of Jack Flaherty. So he's been about what you hoped, I guess. Maybe a little bit of an underachiever, probably. But again, I don't think it was a certainty that he would have a fully healthy year, and that he is at least done. So a mark in his corner on that regard. But like Miles Michaelis, I would say, been a little bit below expectations. Jordan Montgomery, I think, is about matched expectations. But when it boils down and we break it down in that way, you look at the rotation, you recognize that it just hasn't been up to par. And because of the names that we just listed being at least somewhere within the realm of the reasonable, it's very clear that the Cardinals' rotation drop-off has happened specifically because of spots number 4 and spots number 5. The Cardinals have a 4.74 ERA in their starting rotation this season. That ranks 25th in MLB right here at the All-Star break. That is abysmal. One of the worst rotations in baseball. The numbers bear that out. I'll read off the teams that are worse than the Cardinals in their starting rotation this season. The Rockies have an ERA near 6.5. The Athletics are 6.30. The Royals are almost 5.5, and the Detroit Tigers are nearly 5. Those are 4 abysmal ball teams. The other team that is below the Cardinals of the 5, because the Cardinals are 6th from the bottom in MLB, somehow is the Cincinnati Reds, which lead the NL Central at this point. But the Reds have a 5.69 ERA from their starting rotation this season, which is really bad. So you might ask, well, how are they doing what they're doing? Well, we've talked about the Cardinals being lesser than the sum of their parts. I would say that the Reds, with that kind of pitching mark, are performing as greater than the sum of their parts this season. Also, their bullpen ERA, 3.86 compared to the Cardinals at 4.48. So the Reds actually have a better bullpen so far than the Cardinals have this season. And the Reds, I would venture to guess, don't have like the 8-20 record in one-run games. Although I guess that would have gone up a little bit on Sunday because the Cardinals did win a one-run game on Sunday 4-3. So that's a bully for them. But generally, the Cardinals have just underachieved, and they haven't been a clutch team this season. And so maybe there's a little bit of the difference between where the Cardinals are in the standings and where the Reds are, not to mention the bullpen and all these other aspects that you could look to. But bottom line is this: the Cardinals need to be better in the rotation, and we know that 60% of that rotation is going to be gone after this season. As long as the Cardinals don't re-sign Montgomery or Flaherty, which I have kind of had my status quo opinion all season has been that they're not going to. I could be wrong about that. And it's possible that we don't really have that as an option to discuss later on in the season if the Cardinals decide to trade one or both of those guys before the end of this month, which, as we've talked about on B-Shape Daily, would seem like the plausible solution and probably a good idea if the Cardinals end up remaining about where they are in the standings without picking up a ton of ground and making an actual run at this division. Makes sense to trade those guys on expiring contracts. So you've got those two. You've got Adam Wainwright, who, again, I don't think coming into the season people necessarily considered Waino as a number 4 or a number 5, but he's been really the worst guy in the rotation this season, and now he's on the injured list with an ERA ballooned after his last 3 outings just did not go his way. So that's one of the 2 spots. And then the other spot to this point has been Steven Matz, which was then filled by Matthew Liberatore, which was then, kind of a revolving door until we land on Matz again, at least for one of the rotation spots now. And Sunday's game looked pretty good from him. So if he can replicate that moving forward, maybe the Cardinals stumble upon an answer that they didn't necessarily expect they were going to get within this season. But the bottom line is that the Cardinals are going to need starting pitching and guys that they can count on in that rotation come 2024. How do you come up with those guys? Well, you can spend on them. You can spend money in free agency, identify the correct free agents to go after, convince those players to come here, and then make sure you spend enough to compensate them in a way that will make sure they choose St. Louis over another city. It's like twofold. You have to convince them to come here just in general. The idea that, well, do I want to play for the Cardinals with where the organization is, with the city being, maybe not the most attractive destination relative to just, I want to play on a coast, I want to play in warm weather, those sorts of things. Or really it's not playing warm weather. It's more like, where do I want to live in the off season? Like all those things, a lot of elements can work against St. Louis when it comes to those conversations. The Cardinals have always been able to kind of sell the Cardinal way, but that only works for a certain percentage of the MLB player population. But then beyond that, okay, I'm willing to play for the Cardinals. Will they pay me the salary that I think I deserve and is commensurate with my experience and with what the market would dictate for me? All of those things go into, can the Cardinals basically buy some capable participants for their rotation in free agency? Historically, they haven't done a great job of that. We've seen them spend some money, but normally on that second or third shelf, so to speak, rather than go for the top shelf type of arm. They've made plays for those kinds of guys like David Price in past years. That deal would not have panned out had it been signed. But you can look toward the Mike Leakes of the world and more recently the Steven Matz contract. We're still not seeing the book closed on that just yet, but so far it has not been so good when it comes to the $44 million spent on Matz. But that's one way to do it, right? Is free agency, you can fill some holes that way. Another way is to draft and develop these young pitchers, or in the case of the Arozarena trade for Matthew Liberatore, you can trade for a guy that you then develop. Cardinals haven't really been able to develop the immediate answers that I think you're going to be able to rely upon in 2024. Like, based on what we've seen of Liberatore the last couple of years at the big league level, I don't know if that's something you could just pencil into the rotation, right? And he wasn't even drafted by the Cardinals. We mentioned he was via trade, but the guys that they have drafted, like Zach Thompson, first-round pick, Michael McGreevy, are those guys going to be ready? Are those guys going to be able to handle the workload and all of these questions that you would have? Gordon Graceffo, another prospect that they have hopes for, but we'll see what that ends up looking like and whether it translates to the big league level. Like, all of these are questions. And then I guess the other way would be to kind of follow in the footsteps of the Arozarena trade and trade for somebody, but the difference being between what they did with Arozarena and Liberatore, trading for a guy that was drafted out of high school and was certainly a few years away when the Cardinals made the deal for Liberatore, versus what I think they might need during this trade deadline period or even into the offseason would be to trade for somebody that's major league ready or is right on the cusp of being major league ready. And that is one way that I think the Cardinals could pursue before the end of July. Like, I think they could do that for not only this season to plug a guy into a rotation that's missing Adam Wainwright and is underperformed. We mentioned where they rank in ERA as a rotation this season. It's toward the bottom. They're toward the bottom in bullpen ERA as well. So it's been a rough year for the pitching. But they could make a play for somebody via trade that they could plug in almost immediately. And if not, by the beginning of 2024, you expect to be able to do that with whoever they would come up with. Okay, what does it take to trade for that kind of pitcher, or maybe multiple pitchers that you would hope to revamp your rotation with? Well, I think it takes wherever you have a surplus of valuable commodities. And right now, for me, that's the position player group that the Cardinals have at the major league level. Young, controllable talent that has graduated the prospect ranks and has proven to some extent what it can do at the major league level. The Cardinals have a handful of those guys. I would say guys like Brendan Donovan, Lars Nootbaar, Nolan Gorman, and maybe that's a tier in and of itself. And then maybe Tommy Edmonds in that tier. Maybe he's a step below with a guy like Dylan Carlson. But those are the five. And then you have other guys that maybe are still more of that prospect ilk, but aren't necessarily top prospects. And maybe they don't have a great fit with St. Louis, but you could envision them being quality big league ball players. Guys like Juan Yepes and Alec Burleson, I think, would fit the billing in that category. So you've got a number of guys on the 40-man roster who are controllable, who have genuine, even if there's a range there, upside, whether it's offensively, defensively, a combination of the two, depending on which player we're talking about. I feel like that's where the Cardinals have a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to, hey, if there's a team out there like the Seattle Mariners, we've seen a lot of smoke and a lot of conversation about the glut, if you could even call it that when it comes to pitching, but the glut of young pitching that they have in the Mariner organization compared to they kind of feel like they need a little bit of a pick-me-up in terms of the starting lineup. Cardinals could potentially be a nice trade partner for the Mariners. We've done a podcast on it already, but it was several weeks ago before really the rumors began to pick up and swirl even more strongly that maybe nothing imminent between these two sides, but everybody can connect the dots and see where there might be a fit. What's going to be really interesting, though, is you could rank the 5 or 6 or 7 starting pitchers that the Mariners have in their organization, and some of those guys are as elite as it gets when it comes to guys like George Kirby, who is a bright young pitching talent for them that's in their rotation. It's got a 3.09 ERA and is a workhorse. Looks like a frontline starter for years to come. That's like the upper end of the range. And then right behind him is Logan Gilbert, who maybe you would argue would have been ahead of George Kirby as of last year, but Kirby, I think, might have lapped him. I think both guys are still really, really strong. I think they've got a little bit more team control when it comes to Gilbert versus, when it comes to Kirby versus Gilbert. But both guys are right there at the upper echelon. And then you've got the Bryce Millers of the world. These are all up-and-coming guys. Brian Wu, both Miller and Wu have made 11 and 7 starts respectively this season. Both have ERAs in the 3s. So, you're talking about controllable arms that have demonstrated to some degree the ability to get out to the major league level and start games. Very valuable. And then you could even go down even further and talk about some of the prospects that they have, like an Emerson Hancock and some other guys that are on the rise. I'm surely missing a couple of names that Cardinals fans who really follow the prospect ranks would say, hey, that's somebody that maybe could be involved in such a deal if the Cardinals and Mariners were to make something happen. I personally want to continue to stump for pitcher Matt Brash, who came up at the beginning of 2022 and looked like he was going to be part of the rotation for the Mariners, and quickly they found that wasn't panning out. He went back to the minors for a while, but returned as a reliever and has been pretty good as a reliever this season. 3.5 ERA in 43 appearances, and is striking out a bunch of dudes. 62 strikeouts in 36 innings. That would be one of the biggest names that I would go after as the Cardinals, and it would be ideal if you're talking a true blockbuster to pick up one of these young pitchers, whether it's the upper echelon like a Logan Gilbert, which I think would cost you, or kind of shopping on a lower shelf, because the shelves at the Mariners pitching store are all very good value, good opportunity to pick up some talent. So it's not the same as shopping on a lower tiered shelf in the free agents market, as the Cardinals have done in recent years and probably have cost themselves a chance at top talent. I think the Mariners genuinely do have 5 or 6 starting pitching talents that could be very intriguing when it comes to this trade deadline. Some of them are further along than others. Some of them are still in the prospect tier, but man, they've got some good arms. And if they need hitting, this is the time to match up. If you're the St. Louis Cardinals, and Jerry DiPoto is their GM, he runs their show. I don't know if he's the Pobo over there or the GM. Like Mo is the Pobo in St. Louis. Whatever they call him, it doesn't really matter. He runs the show over there, and he's not afraid to make a bold move. He is one of the most active traders in MLB of the executives that run teams. And if they've got a need, they're a little antsy out there in the AL West, too, because of the way that division is shaken out with the Rangers really taking a step forward. The Astros are always going to be competitive, and the Angels have done a little bit better this year as well. So the Mariners and their executives, I think, are kind of feeling the heat a little bit and willing to make bold moves to try and improve their standing, not let the one playoff appearance that they had last year sort of evaporate and lose that steam and that momentum. They're looking to win. They're looking to make it happen, and they're looking to balance out their roster. Cardinals would be a great fit with the Mariners. The question, though, is going to be, if you were to rank 1 through 5 or 1 through 7, whatever, however many potential pitcher names that they would have available and that they would consider actually moving, because it's like, okay, George Kirby, they're not going to move him. Same as I would say the Cardinals aren't going to move Jordan Walker. But when you hear guys like John Morosi talk about it on his podcast or the MLB Network podcast, wherever he was discussing this recently, you hear him say, well, if Logan Gilbert would be available, maybe Cardinals trade Jordan Walker and Brenden Donovan. It's like, whoa, slow down, everybody, slow down. Like, if the Mariners are protecting their top guys, the Cardinals are going to be protecting their top guys as well. And I think that includes Jordan Walker, but I also anticipate that it would include Brenden Donovan. I would be very surprised to see Brenden Donovan moved. If the Cardinals did move him, I would be very concerned for what that would mean, because I think it would be underestimating the value of Brenden Donovan, which I know the Cardinals don't do. I know they really like Brenden Donovan because of his versatility, the flexibility that he adds to your daily lineup, to your defensive alignment, and he's just a really good player. Smart baseball player, winning baseball player. I think he needs to stay a Cardinal, especially if you're kind of feeling the heat a little bit on letting the Cardinal way go a little bit and letting the fundamentals that should be at the top of the priority list, letting those kind of falter to an extent. Having a bunch of Brenden Donovans around is the way that you can get that kind of thing back in your organization. So I wouldn't recommend trading those kinds of guys away, personally. That being said, I understand that other teams probably see the value in him as well. And so if the Mariners and Cardinals hook up on a conversation and the Cardinals are like, well, you can stop asking about Jordan Walker, in the same way you're not going to trade George Kirby to us, and maybe not Logan Gilbert either. Like, we're not sending you Jordan Walker. He's a franchise cornerstone. We're going to build around him. Mariners would say, okay, we get that. We got to shop collectively on a lower tier when we get into these negotiations. But then the Mariners might say, so then maybe that means Brenden Donovan. The Cardinals are like, well, wait a minute. We consider him to be a foundational name as well. And you can see how, if both sides sort of begin to hoard the talent that they want to keep, which is natural in these moments, it's going to mean they're going to have to find some common ground on the lesser names. Does that mean the Mariners would say, all right, we're not trading these 3 or 4 top names here, but we'll give you this pitcher, and we really do kind of think Tommy Edman would help us out? Is there a match there? I think that could be beneficial to the Cardinals, even though I really like Tommy Edman as a baseball player. I think what he brings to the table, it's maybe a little easier to replicate some of that, which may not totally be fair, because Cardinals don't have a lot of guys with his speed, his ability to steal bases, his ability to go from being a solid shortstop defensively, a Gold Glove second baseman, and then throwing him into center field, and he's a plus defender there in many regards. Like, maybe I'm not being totally fair to the skill set of Tommy Edman to say, well, you can replicate that. You can't entirely replicate it, but I could also see the case where it takes talent to get talent, and the Cardinals have guys that collectively, I think, do some of the things that Tommy Edman brings to the table. They don't have the pitching that they need in the rotation. And so nobody said that you're going to be able to trade Tyler O'Neill to get a good young pitcher. You're not. O'Neill has underperformed. He has failed basically by every measure so far this season. in living up to the hype that was established by his 2021 campaign. The Cardinals are paying for that. They've made decisions over the years when it comes to their outfield. And they've backed guys like Tyler O'Neill, and they've even given him the opportunity to be in center field when he, frankly, never made sense. Never made sense. And I was pretty consistent about that on B Shape Daily. If you go back and check the archives, didn't get it then, don't get it now. Eventually, the Cardinals kind of threw that idea by the wayside, but not before weeks and weeks went by of just very puzzling lineup construction for the Cardinals. But they traded away guys like Arozarena. Adolis Garcia, his name comes up because of him being in the All-Star lineup, him being in the Home Run Derby. That's another guy that they didn't prioritize, right? I can remember being in the Springfield Cardinals clubhouse and just before a game and seeing that guy going, holy crap, who is that? Because he just stood out from the rest of his teammates. And lo and behold, we're seeing Adolis Garcia end up making a name for himself. Now, that's a hard one to gripe on. I understand why we do it, because it's another one that got away. But that was one that, the Cardinals traded him for cash, and then he was eventually DFA'd to where any team could have had him. But he goes back to the Rangers, and the Rangers made good on the second chance that they gave Adolis Garcia, as did Garcia himself make good on that opportunity. But the Cardinals made decisions and have made decisions over the years when it comes to who gets the priority in their playing time and their opportunity in their outfield and who doesn't, or who has to go find it elsewhere. And it seems they've pretty consistently made some blunders in that regard, right? And so maybe that's the risk in this conversation, which is to say, like, coming into the year, Lars Nootbaar was not for sale. Cardinals weren't looking to trade him. Teams were asking. They were saying no thanks. Dylan Carlson was once that kind of guy. Last trade deadline, that's where the team viewed him for the most part. But has that changed? Has it changed at all with Nootbaar, with what we've seen from him this season, which isn't to say that he's had a bad year, but maybe a letdown compared to the lofty hopes or expectations, whichever you want to phrase it as, that were upon his shoulders going all the way back to the offseason, even before spring training, before the World Baseball Classic. Ollie Marmol saying early in the offseason that that's the one guy that's got his name penciled into a daily spot in the lineup, Lars Nootbaar. Of the outfield group, they planned to prioritize his playing time. And at some point, when you've got all of these guys, 5, 6, 7 guys, it's been the case for years and years. Every year coming into spring, it seems like there are open outfield spots that maybe some years more than others, guys are penciled in with an edge over their teammates, but generally there's opportunity there. And the Cardinals have to decide at some point who they're going to back, which horse do they believe can race out to a victory at that position and claim it and help the team win games. They've got to make those decisions, and like I said, historically hasn't always been the best decision. And now we're coming up to another period where not just with the outfielders, but with kind of the glut on the infield as well, whether it's Donovan, whether it's Edman, who's kind of a little bit of both. Both those guys are infield/outfield at this point, with as much as they've played in both areas. Nootbaar, Carlson, and then there's Nolan Gorman. And I know we spent a lot of time kind of leading up to the conversation about Gorman, but that's the guy that I look at and think has the most intrigue. When you look at just a ton of team control remaining, looking at Baseball Reference, it said he's not a free agent until 2029 because he only played a partial season last year. Going to get that extra year of team control. Like, it's going to be a while before Nolan Gorman, you even have to think about arbitration for him for several more years because he just doesn't have a ton of service time. But there was a time earlier this season where you really saw him raking and thought he was kind of establishing himself as the top prospect that he was and finally coming through on that promise and turning into a middle-of-the-order bat. I think I don't want to rip the guy, but we've pretty well definitively seen in the weeks more recently that that's just not the case right now, that there are still holes in Nolan Gorman's game, especially offensively. Defensively, he doesn't have to be a superstar. He doesn't have to be a Gold Glover, but you want to see that power manifest on a consistent basis in terms of his offensive production, to have him be the kind of guy that he was being billed as. And I was doing some of that billing. I told everybody that I thought he'd be an all-star this year. That was my bold prediction. Well, he's fallen off the pace. Last 30 games, he's hitting 157. That's a 102 at-bat sample size. He's hitting 157 with a 232 on base and a 294 slug. That's over more than a month worth of games. Because he had that hot stretch in kind of mid to late May, really was riding it during that Dodgers series. We started to see him thrive against lefties as well. Like, it was all going for him, and has really fallen off the pace since then to where over the last month or so, he's hitting 157, which is 4 home runs, and, I mean, not great on base, slugging south of 300. Yeah, that's not a guy that is in the middle of your order, and probably not a guy that you could consider even playing every day, especially on this roster. And it goes back to the offseason when I said, it wouldn't surprise me to see them trade Nolan Gorman because they've got Brendan Donovan and they really want to prioritize playing time for him. And we didn't know about DeYoung at the time. We weren't really counting on him, but we kind of figured Tommy Edman at shortstop. We didn't know that the outfield would see Tyler O'Neill really taper off and some different injuries going on throughout that group during the early portion of the season. But I looked at that second base and said, I don't know what they're going to do in terms of DH. I wasn't anticipating Nolan Gorman getting the everyday DH opportunities. I kind of thought you'd see better play from the outfielders in general to where there'd be a fourth outfielder that would kind of demand a spot in the lineup on a daily basis, and that guy would get more DH reps, and they'd kind of rotate through the outfield of who's actually going to be in the field on a given day. You got the Carlsons and the Nootbars, and knowing Jordan Walker was going to be in the fold at some point, I just kind of figured there'd be more outfielders playing the DH role on a day-to-day basis. And so I kind of looked at Nolan Gorman and thought, man, he could be an odd man out because when he slumps, what do the Cardinals do about it? Do they decide to ride him through that slump? Because it's not the decision they made with him last year when he went through slumps. They did have Albert Pujols to fall back on in the DH spot, and so it made it a lot easier to bury Nolan Gorman on the bench. But if you believe in Nolan Gorman as a hitter and just believe he's streaky, that kind of means you have to ride through the bad streaks in order to get back to the good ones. And I didn't necessarily have faith that the Cardinals would be willing to do that with him. And this year, I think they've been more committed to allowing him to play through some things. But also, is that for the best? 229 average, a 314 on base, and a 772 OPS this season for Nolan Gorman, which is fine. I mean, it's a solid mark, 772. But the way it's come about was with some really hot play earlier on and then going ice cold over the past month plus. And the more and more I think about it, the more and more I'm coming through to the opinion that Nolan Gorman might be the right guy to move if he still has value. If the last month or so has completely tanked it and teams don't believe in him, don't believe in his future as a potential 30 home run guy on an annual basis that can hit for that power and continue to develop because he's only 23 years old, like there are two sides to this coin. The one side is, you know what, the Cardinals have a lot of mental infielders and they've got Mason Wynn on the way. Nolan Gorman is not an exceptional defender, although I've given him credit for the strides he has made at second base this season. I think he's been average to above average, but has maybe fallen on hard times a little bit more recently. But I look at Nolan Gorman, and if he's not going to be that consistent power guy where, as a result, the OPS is 850 or 875 and he's just a stud, and it's hard to be that level of stud when you have some of the holes in your game that he's displayed over the past few weeks. If he's not going to be that guy, and defensively he's sort of a square peg in a round hole just based on the construction of this Cardinals roster, it seems like he'd be the guy that is the highest combination of makes sense to unload him based on where you have fits on the rest of your roster to fill what he does. Maybe not the power from the left side, but at least positionally, you have ways to cover for losing him. And if he's going to be streaky and never maybe turn into the true cleanup bat, number 3 hole hitter, 850 to 875 to 900 OPS, perennial all-star kind of guy. If he's not going to be those things, and somebody else still might see that in him, that's where the evaluation has to come in for the Cardinals, and they could maybe have to make a difficult decision at this deadline. And I'm not saying they should or shouldn't do it, by the way. I'm just evaluating and analyzing and taking a look at what could be facing this team. Because ultimately, we have seen the Cardinals make mistakes before, thinking a guy was one thing and then he proves to be another, riding off a guy before they probably should have. But in those cases, and guys like Adolis Garcia and guys like Randy Arozarena, for whatever reasons, and we can spend a whole different podcast on that, the Cardinals never really prioritized playing time for those guys, and they got a couple dozen at-bats apiece at the big league level. We never really saw them to know what they were or were not. Nolan Gorman, at least, has gotten a good chunk of at-bats over the last couple of years at the big league level to where, he's got 625 career MLB plate appearances. It's a full season's worth, and he's a 746 OPS, a 106 OPS plus. He's an above-average hitter. 31 home runs in those 625 PAs. It's 170 games, so it's a little bit more than a full season. But in that span, he's also hitting 228, a 307 on base, and has 202 career strikeouts. So maybe like the Cardinals are having to make this determination. Is that what he is, or does he have another gear and we're afraid to miss it? Because with those other guys that didn't get but 20 plate appearances as Cardinals, like Randy Arozarena, they didn't seem all that afraid of missing that next gear, and those guys certainly have proven to have that next gear. They're athletic outfielders that can run, they can throw, they can hit for power, they can play their positions defensively. They're just really dang good. Both Garcia and Arozarena. Nolan Gorman has at least gotten the sample size, but has it been a sample size where the Cardinals have now made a determination on what he is and believe that maybe they can extract more value by moving him? Or is it a case where they would still say, well, he's 23 years old. We need to see this through because the raw power that he possesses from the left side is rare in the game. And if you have an opportunity to still tap into that as he gets into his kind of more into his prime and more comfortable as a professional, it would benefit them to do that because you don't want to let another guy get away. But the reason that I won't say what the Cardinals should definitively do here one way or the other is because I don't have a big enough ego to pretend like I know the answer. I don't think I know the answer. I don't think a lot of Cardinals fans do for sure. I could tell you what my opinion is. My opinion is that Nolan Gorman probably for his career has an OPS better than 746, which is right now his career OPS in the big leagues. But I don't know if it's much better than 772. Could it be 780? Could it be 790? Absolutely. I think that's in the range of possibilities. Do I expect Nolan Gorman to clear 800 for a career OPS if he plays 10 to 15 years in the big leagues? 15 would be a pretty long career. Let's just say 10 to 12 years. North of 800, I would probably take the under, but narrowly. But if he's a 795 OPS for his career, that's a very capable hitter. It's not the cleanup bat or the number 3 hitter that I think the Cardinals are wishing on a cloud, hoping that he'll be. But that'd still be pretty good. But I don't know if Nolan Gorman is going to eradicate enough of the swing and miss, enough of the plate discipline inconsistencies, enough of the chasing pitch recognition issues, all of those things. I don't know if he's going to eradicate enough of those downside pieces of his game in order to turn into the perennial all-star that he would almost need to become in order to outright dismiss the idea that the Cardinals could trade him right now for pitching. Just based on the way they're set up roster-wise. And what stings about this, too, is if you believe the reporting from the offseason, right, it started out that the Athletics wanted Donovan and Nootbaar, right? I think this was Derek Gould that had this. Donovan and Nootbaar for Sean Murphy. And I thought that was hefty, and even still, knowing what we know about those two and their performance this season and the performance of Sean Murphy, which has been off the chain. I mean, that dude has been unbelievable this season for the Atlanta Braves. And is he not on the All-Star team? That seems almost impossible. Baseball Reference hasn't updated it yet to say it, and I admittedly maybe didn't see the full roster. Surely he's an All-Star. Yeah, he is. I was going to say, there's no way that he's not. He's got a 999 OPS. Sean Murphy does. That's he's having an MVP-like season from the catcher position. 17 homers, 55 RBI, 306 average, 400 on base, 599 slug for a 999 OPS. That's an outrageous season from Sean Murphy at this point. He would have been a fantastic Cardinal. The Cardinals evidently chimed back after declining to go Nootbaar Donovan. And again, this is, I believe, from Derek Gould's reporting. Said, here's a list of 4 guys, pick 2. Carlson's name, I believe, was on that list. And then it was guys like Burleson Yepes, which are kind of afterthoughts. I'd throw either of them into any trade just as a sweetener if it helps. Burleson's a little more valuable than Yepes. Yepes is a man without a home in terms of defensive position. And so I think if he can find a home elsewhere, it benefits all parties. But the one name in that list of 4 reportedly was Nolan Gorman. And there was a time this year where you might have thought, oh man, it's crazy the Cardinals were willing to trade him. But no, it tracks with what I thought in the offseason, especially now that we see Nolan Gorman come back down to earth. And really, he's done more than come back down to earth. He has crashed back into the Earth's surface with a sub-300 slugging percentage over the past month plus. And it tracks that, maybe the Athletics kind of saw in Nolan Gorman the inconsistencies as well, and they weren't sold. Now, would you have traded Gorman and maybe a pitching prospect? That would have made a little more sense. And then you could have saved $87.5 million, devoted that toward fixing your roster in another way instead of Contreras, who is coming along offensively, but he's not doing what Sean Murphy's doing. And Sean Murphy's a Gold Glover as well. Wilson Contreras is, God love him, but he's kind of been the anchor holding back the fundamentals of the team in a lot of ways, which is different from saying that the Cardinals did right by throwing him under the bus and having the weird PR blitz that they did of, he's not going to be our catcher, but you can't know why. And it was all very strange. That wasn't the way to handle that. But in a separate issue, yeah, he's has had passed balls. He has had throwing errors, base running gaffes. Sean Murphy is looking like maybe the one that got away. But again, if the Athletics were not going to be reasonable about the price, and I say reasonable, they ultimately traded him and didn't get much at all in return. But we've talked about how that was thanks to the Cardinals basically taking themselves out of the running voluntarily when they signed Wilson Contreras. Suddenly the Athletics said, well, we want to trade this player, and now there's one fewer suitor. And so the Braves ended up getting a sweetheart deal, in my opinion. But all of this is our way to evaluate, okay, the Cardinals seemingly were willing to move Nolan Gorman in a trade in the offseason. The one that they really wanted to make was for Sean Murphy. I think they would have put Gorman and then some in there. And it didn't end up happening because maybe the Athletics weren't feeling it. What do the Mariners or other teams that have pitching feel about Nolan Gorman, I think, is the question at this point. Because would you trade Nolan Gorman to fix your pitching? I think if you're the Cardinals, the answer is yes. But if they say, well, but you can't have this guy, you can't have Gilbert, you can't have, we're not going to throw in Matt Brash. If they end up going down to their 4th or 5th or 6th best option that they're offering to the Cardinals in terms of pitching, and wanting Nolan Gorman, which is one of the Cardinals' conceivably better options, even if it's a guy that we've talked about would make sense to move just based on the construction of the team's roster, that's what's tricky. If the Cardinals have to give up Gorman, but they only get kind of the bottom barrel guy that the Mariners have to offer, whoever that would be, then that could end up being a disappointment. That could end up being a move that reeks of desperation. But if the Mariners value Gorman as a guy that has insane raw power and a ton of potential, and yes, he's got holes in his game, but you're going to get some really good production over the course of the next 5 years before he's a free agent, and the Cardinals can figure out a way to finagle one of the really legit pitchers that they can plug right into their rotation for Nolan Gorman, man, that's something I think you'd have to consider. But let me know what you think in the YouTube comments about Nolan Gorman. Is what I'm saying making sense? It's not like I'm trying to minimize the kid. I think very highly of him. But I'm also just looking at it from the front office's perspective, trying to figure out, hey, they know they've got holes in the rotation, and their luck in filling those holes via just throwing money at the problem has not been successful in the recent past. And so would a trade be something they're willing to consider when they've got so many middle infielders, so many guys that can play the outfield and guys that can move around to fill the gaps where a Nolan Gorman might live? Let me know what you think in the YouTube comments about that conversation. I'm sure there's more that we could say about it, but I want to get into the draft pick of Quinn Mathews earlier today before we wrap up this edition of B-Shape Daily. But make sure you guys are subscribed. If you like this content, please do subscribe to the Brenden Schaeffer St. Louis Cardinals writer YouTube channel. And you can also follow B-Shape Daily on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Let's talk a little Quinn Mathews, though, before we get out of here. 6'5" left-hander out of Stanford. Threw 156 pitches in a game about a month ago when Stanford beat Texas in a super regional game. Ultimately, Stanford advanced to the College World Series. I believe Mathews pitched in one of those games as well, didn't fare as well. But this was a story that was kind of a national story when it happened, and I noticed it then and remember thinking, wow, 156 pitches for a kid that does have pro prospects. I wonder what that ends up doing and how that might affect him in the draft. I thought he was maybe a kid that would go more second, third round. He ends up falling to the fourth round. The Cardinals scoop him up. And once they did, I thought this is going to be fascinating. I'm really curious to see what the Cardinals organization, what Randy Flores, the scouting director, has to say about the notion of this kid throwing so many pitches in one game, going for that complete game. And Randy Flores was asked about it today by John Denton. Here was the exchange and the answer by Randy Flores, Cardinals scouting director, on the $1 million question when it comes to Quinn Mathews.
Last one, Randy, you're a former pitcher. Did you cringe when you saw 156 pitches?
I actually really, really respected it. This gray hair kind of gives it away. But I pitched in college back in the time when they did not keep track, really, of pitches the way they do now. If you were to humor yourself and look on the World Wide Web, way, way back when, there's probably a screenshot somewhere of how many innings I threw in a collegiate career. Because they just weren't tracking as much as they are now, every pitch and every inning. Mm-hmm. And so, I actually really, really respected it. You don't want that every week, and it's not something that we go and seek. Or for someone who is that willing to compete, I thought that was very attractive, actually.
So there you have it from the Cardinals and Randy Flores. Basically, the viewpoint on Quinn Mathews and drafting a guy in the fourth round that had just thrown a 156-pitch complete game about a month prior to the draft was that they respected the kid's tenacity and the desire to go out there and grind and be that dude for his team. I think that is an admirable quality. I think there's reason to be concerned, though, on the other side about what that might do to his arm, and we'll see how the Cardinals end up handling him. That didn't emerge from the conversation. I wish, now thinking back, I would have dove in and asked about that, of like, well, what's the plan for how quickly you're going to ramp up this guy who clearly just threw a lot as his team making it all the way to the College World Series. That'll be something we try to scoop up. I don't believe anybody touched on that. So we'll see kind of in the coming days what the Cardinals decide ultimately to do with him after they presumably get him signed. But I thought that was an interesting answer from Randy Flores. Doesn't seem to be a concern for them, but I do wonder if the Cardinals are careful with his workload the rest of the way, because he threw, a lot of times you have high school, college pitchers, and it's all about trying to get them up to what a workload would look like so they could join a big league rotation a couple of years after or whenever they're primed and ready to do so. But sometimes the innings log on the arm, you don't want to just go from a guy that hasn't thrown a ton to suddenly he's pitching every fifth day, starting 30 times a year. You're not going to be able to ramp up right away to 150, 160, 170 innings. This kid, Quinn Mathews, threw 124 and two-thirds innings this past season at Stanford. Had a 3.75 ERA, so not like gaudy college numbers, but he was a fourth-round pick for a reason. His senior season, I believe, was his fourth collegiate season at Stanford. 124 and two-thirds innings, 158 strikeouts, so good K numbers there. Allowed his fair share of hits, allowed his fair share of runs and homers, and walked some guys as well. 40 walks in those 124 innings. But I think the raw stuff and the strikeout numbers are encouraging, and the frame is encouraging. A 6'5" lefty, you can't hardly go wrong with that. So I'll be very intrigued to see what ends up becoming of this kid. He's nearly 23 years old already. Like I said, a college senior, turns 23 on October 4th. How do the Cardinals want to handle that? It's like on one hand, you want to maybe manage his workload. On the other hand, he's not like a young prospect. I think he's a guy that you want to try to get to maybe even the double-A level as quickly as you can, maybe a little high-A action double-A, because this is a guy that was very experienced at the collegiate level. You might just want to get him to an Arizona Fall League, but then you wonder if they want to put the innings on his arm after he pitched so much. Like, some interesting decisions the Cardinals are going to have to make there, and we'll try to find out more about what the game plan might be for Quinn Mathews. But nice, kind of interesting draft pick, I think, for the Cardinals, as they went heavy in the college atmosphere this year with a lot of outfielders and a lot of arms. But the big lefty, Quinn Mathews, coming out of Stanford, I think was maybe the most notable and interesting pick of day 2 of the MLB draft. At least that is from a Cardinals perspective. But let me know what you guys think of the show. What do you think about the Cardinals draft and about this conversation about Nolan Gorman in particular? Let me know in the YouTube comments how you're feeling about this Cardinals team approaching the deadline. You still thinking they should be in sell mode, and maybe how far should they go to revamp the roster when it comes to trying to fix things up for 2024? Some interesting conversations, I'm sure, ahead. We'll continue to have them right here on the Brenden Schaeffer YouTube channel and, of course, on the B Schaef Daily podcast. So make sure you get it wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be locked and loaded for the stretch run of this season and for the exciting times ahead when it comes to the MLB trade deadline. But that is going to do it for this edition of the show. I thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on B Shape Daily. Peace.